All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyler Castle, and I'm a member of the academic programs team at the American Enterprise Institute. In the midst of the ongoing pandemic and quarantine, we are delighted to be continuing a series of virtual conversations with experts about some of the biggest policy challenges that we face today. I want to give a special thanks to the Hertog Foundation for their partnership on this series. As with past conversations, I should note that we encourage you to make use of the Q&A feature, which you can access at the bottom of your screen, and start submitting your questions at the beginning of the call. We'll have plenty of time to get to your questions. Our guest today is my AEI colleague, Michael Strain, who will be speaking with us about the underlying health of the American economy and the economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Strain is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at AEI. His research focuses on labor economics, public finance, and social policy. Previously worked in the Center for Economic Studies at the US Census Bureau and in the Macroeconomics Research Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He's also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, where you can read his work on a weekly basis, and he's been published in a variety of other popular outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. His most recent book, which was released in February of this year, is The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. Thanks for taking the time to join us, Mike.
Thank you.
First off, how have you been weathering
49 participants.
Huh?
We have 49 participants.
We do. We're glad that they're here.
Thank you.
How's the quarantine been going so far for you?
Well, it's terrible.
Are you surviving though?
I find it to be very difficult.
Yeah, right there with you. I will say, of the quarantine beards that I've seen, I think you're winning that award, so you can.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't even know. Like, I think second place is a distant second at this point.
It's true. Okay, well, let's dive right into it. Let's transport ourselves back a couple months before the pandemic hit. You argued in your book that despite popular opinion, the American dream was alive and well for most Americans and that the economy was as healthy as it's been in decades. Could you give us your basic argument and a couple of the key data points that you use to support it?
Yeah, so what I do in my book is I kind of take the longer view of the experience that typical workers and typical households have had. So I look over a 30-year period. And then in addition, I try and really zoom out and look at how, the kind of typical household, typical worker, the median, the worker kind of right in the middle is doing. And I did that because, I was just struck by the kind of degree to which there was bipartisan support for the narrative that the American dream was in great peril. It is common to hear both Republicans and Democrats argue that wages have been stagnant for decades, argue that life was better at some point in the past, whether it's the 1970s or the 1950s, argue that households haven't seen their standard of living increase, argue that America is no longer an upwardly mobile society, argue that capitalism and market forces have really accrued to the detriment of typical workers and have hollowed out the middle class and all this sort of stuff. I mean, this is something you hear from Republicans like Senator Josh Hawley. It's something you hear from President Trump, of course, who's also a Republican. Something you hear from Bernie Sanders, from Elizabeth Warren, even a little bit from Joe Biden. And outside of politics, you hear this from prominent commentators like Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow. You hear it from prominent public intellectuals like Joseph Stiglitz. You hear it from prominent investors like the billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, who flat out said the American dream is dead on 60 Minutes recently. And so there's this real kind of bipartisan consensus. It's a consensus that extends outside of partisan politics as well. And I wanted to just look into that. And what I discovered is that I really think that narrative is false. If you look at the wages of typical workers, workers who are not managers, the kind of 80% of the workforce that is composed of non-managerial workers. What you see is that their wages have gone up by about a third over the last 3 decades. That's not stagnant. We shouldn't be happy with that. We shouldn't be satisfied with it. We shouldn't say, okay, job well done. I mean, we should be rooting for faster wage growth. We should be attempting through public policy to get wages to grow faster. But it's just not the case that wages have been stagnant for decades. Upward mobility, the same thing. You know, if you what I do in the book is I look at people who are in their 40s today, and I look to see how many of them have a higher household income than their parents had. It's about 3/4. If you look at 40-year-olds today, 40 people in their 40s today who were raised in the bottom 20%, about 86% of them have a higher household income than their parents had when their parents were the same age. So, you know, to me, we have a really significant degree of economic mobility in the U.S. economy. Of course, you'd rather that be 100%, and we should have policies that attempt to get it to 100%. So I'm not arguing for complacency, but I think that actually represents a high degree of upward mobility. Certainly doesn't represent immobility. You know, similar story with what's happened in the middle of the labor market. It's certainly the case that technological automation has reduced the share of employment in manufacturing. You hear from the political left and right that that's actually been globalization, but technological automation has had a much larger role to play in that phenomenon. That's happened, no question about it. But the public debate seems to forget that creative destruction creates as well as destroys. And at the same time that we've seen a decline in the employment share in kind of traditional middle wage jobs, like manufacturing, like clerical jobs, you've actually seen an increase in what I call in the book the new middle, occupations that are definitely in the middle of the labor market, occupations that are definitely in the middle of the labor market, that pay middle wages, that require middle skills, but that have seen significant growth over the past 20 years or so. So you know, I wanted to take the broad view and look at these, you know, really basic questions about how the economy works and how most people experience it. And what I find is it's just very, very different than the narrative you hear. In addition to not wanting to be complacent, I mean, again, I think public policy should be actively trying to improve these outcomes, even if they look reasonably good. And I have a chapter in the book devoted to that. I also want to make sure that I'm not interpreted as minimizing or diminishing or glossing over the serious challenges that we do face. There are certainly groups of people in American life who really are suffering and have had a really difficult time over the last decade or so. And I have some thoughts about that in the book. I don't want to minimize that. I don't want to diminish it. I just want to say that I think we're so focused, and over the last few years, we've become so focused on those pockets of problems, opioid addiction, you know, the 50-year-old guy who loses his job at a factory and never graduated high school. What's he going to do? You know, those pockets of very real problems. I think we're so focused on those that the public debate has confused the typical experience that people will have with those pockets of problems. You know, most people aren't a 50-year-old guy who just lost his job at a factory and who never graduated from high school, for example. And so I spent some time in the book on that as well. You know, right now we're facing a very serious challenge. And this challenge really kind of reared its head over the last 6 or 8 weeks here in the United States. And we're seeing economic damage accrue at a velocity that we've really never seen in the United States. And right now, as we speak, there are 20 million people roughly who have lost their jobs in just the last several weeks. That's an enormous magnitude. Many of those people have families, and the knock-on effects of this economic catastrophe are significant. If you look over the last 30 years, as I do in the book, what you see is a long-term economic success story. We have had lots of challenges over the last 30 years. Most recently, the Great Recession that began in December 2007, and that really continued for many people until, say the year 2015 or 2016. So I want to be clear that the last 30 years are not a story of uninterrupted success, but they are a story of long-term success. And they're a story of American workers and American households overcoming challenges and continuing to have an upward economic march. My strong suspicion is that we are in for a difficult several months, but once we are on the other side of this public health crisis, that American workers and American households will continue that upward march and will overcome this challenge as they always have. And so the story I tell in the book, I think, should provide some hope for people who are really concerned about how this is going to affect people over the longer term.
Yeah, so you would argue that this is really just, pressing pause on the economy that is functioning well, and that once we are able to reopen again, we'll be in pretty good shape. Is that what you would say?
Well, that's the hope. It really depends on kind of how long this lasts, and it depends on what the policy response to this is and how effective it is. I certainly think that if the shutdown is short, if the shutdown ends in the next few weeks, as opposed to ending, in July, August, September, something like that, and I think if both state governments and the federal government are able to respond to this with what's required, then what I think we will see is a massive increase in the unemployment rate. We'll see 30 million people unemployed who otherwise wouldn't be. The peak in the Great Recession occurred when one out of every 10 workers were unemployed. So a 10% unemployment rate. As we speak, the unemployment rate is likely 15, 16, 17%, and it could go even higher. So we really are in much worse shape than we were even at the peak of the Great Recession. But I think if we can end this shutdown relatively quickly, and if policy can respond effectively, then I think we will be in a position to see a very rapid decline in the unemployment rate. We'll be in a position to see economic growth start, as quickly as the third quarter of this year, which begins over the summer. I suspect that we will be fully recovered by Christmas of 2021. So I think we can see a very rapid recovery, but a lot of that depends on what happens really over the next 3 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about what the government's response has been so far in its efforts to recover and rescue the economy from the pandemic. So the biggest chunk of that obviously was the CARES Act, which was passed a couple weeks ago now. What do you think is maybe the best thing that piece of legislation did, and what's the worst thing that it did?
Well, I think the best thing it did was launch a new program called the Paycheck Protection Program that is designed to do a few things. It's designed to stop millions and millions and millions of small businesses from going bankrupt. These are businesses who can't issue their own debt, who can't, enter into sophisticated credit markets. Think the restaurant down the street, think a pizza shop, think a coffee shop, think a barber shop. Those sorts of those sorts of businesses. And the program attempts to keep workers attached to those businesses and off the unemployment rolls as well. How does it do that? The program offers these businesses 8 weeks of a grant. And if they keep their workers on the payroll, they don't have to pay the grant back. It's just free money. And so it really is designed to kind of keep those relationships going. That's really important. I mean, it's important because it stops workers from being unemployed. It means that when the public health crisis is over, workers can just go back to their old jobs. If workers are laid off, a whole lot of them are going to have to find a new job. That's bad for those workers. It also is bad for the overall economy because it takes time to find a new job. So it keeps workers attached to their employer. It's also a good policy because, as recently as February 15th, these businesses were viable, productive, profitable businesses. And it would be devastating to the economy if we had to rebuild that ecosystem of small business from scratch. That would make the recovery from this take much longer, and it would just be wasteful. We would lose lots of talent and lots of ideas, and we'd lose years of accumulated knowledge on the part of these business owners on how to do their jobs well. And of course, it would be terrible for the business owners as well. So that program is a really important and good program. The worst thing in the bill is the amount by which unemployment insurance benefits were made more generous. So the bill correctly made UI more generous than it was under existing law, but it went a little too far, and it's created a situation where lots of workers actually will earn more money or receive a greater income every week if they're laid off and go on unemployment benefits than if they stay at their job. So that's bad. That's not that bad right now while we're shut down, but that could end up being problematic when we're trying to get the economy back going again.
Mm-hmm. So on the Paycheck Protection Program, reports have been that it's going to run out of funding in the next couple of days, and there's some uncertainty of whether funding will be increased for it. What do you think of the prospects of that?
Well, I think it definitely will run out of money. Congress allocated $349 billion to the program for these grants that I was describing, the grants that small businesses can receive if they don't lay off their workers. And we've, the program has been online for about a week and a half. And in that week and a half, 1 million of these grants have been approved, roughly speaking, and about 230 billion of that 350 billion has been allocated. And banks are revving up, so they're learning how to do this. So the rate at which new funds are going to be allocated is going to increase over the course of this week. So we are very likely going to run out of money even this week, certainly next week, for that program. And so and it needs more money. And Senator McConnell attempted to appropriate additional money for this program. The Senate is in recess, and Senator McConnell tried to use a procedure that would allow an additional $250 billion to be appropriated for this program without requiring the entire Senate to come back. A catch of the procedure that Senator McConnell tried to use is that any one senator could block the procedure he was trying to use. And Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer did not like the idea of topping up that program in the absence of things that they wanted. And so it kind of devolved into a political fight, and here we are without enough money and nothing having been done. So, maybe the optimist would say that we'll be able to appropriate additional funding when the Senate and House return. I think it's unclear when that will be. And, that's just another layer of complexity and challenge that we face right now is, physically getting the 535 members of Congress back to Washington so they can continue to pass laws that will help the situation.
Mhm. So in addition to that possibly being an additional action that the government takes, there's already talk of a fourth phase, a more comprehensive phase of response to the pandemic. What do you think should be a priority of any fourth phase legislation?
Well, I think a top priority should be figuring out what is working and what isn't, and what needs to be addressed from the third phase. And I think that is something that we already know some things about. For example, we know that the PPP program needs more money. There are also some changes to its implementation that I would like to see. I think we know that state and local governments need more money as well. States can't run deficits the way the federal government can. And so we don't want these states to be in a situation where their public health spending really needs to ramp up. And in order to do that, they have to reduce expenses in other parts of the state. Why don't we want that? Because that very likely would result in layoffs, which would compound our labor market problems and see more workers without jobs. So I think it's pretty clear that needs to be in there. I think it's pretty clear that Congress needs, as part of a phase 4 package, to have a better public health response to this situation, to figure out how to structure laws that allow for a more adequate testing regime to exist, funding so that states can do the kind of contact tracing that's necessary to contain a flare-up of coronavirus that may occur perhaps this fall. Those sorts of public health measures, I think, need to, quite a bit of additional thought. And then I think, the question will just be, where are we? If the phase 4 package is passed and maybe we've already reopened, maybe we are a week away from reopening, something like that, then I think the response will look very different from a situation where we're still shut down. I think we will need, if we're reopened, then we'll be able to have some sense of the magnitude of the damage to the economy and of the nature of that damage, and then we'll be able to do a better job at targeting efforts to rebuilding. If we're still shut down, then the situation is just getting liquidity to businesses and getting money to households so that they can kind of continue to meet their obligations, meet their financial obligations during the shutdown. And so, again, the question is just how long do we do this for?
I think one question that conservatives and libertarians are probably having right now is, we already spent $2 trillion in response to the pandemic. There's the likelihood of spending quite a bit more. Should debt and the budget be a concern at all? Or should we just see this as, an unprecedented response to an unprecedented challenge that we should be okay with?
I think we need to be concerned about debt and deficits for the same reason that we always do. I think we should be spending what needs to be spent. So I don't think we should be saying, this program or this amount of money would do a lot of good right now, but the deficit. At the same time, I don't think we should be saying, the deficit doesn't matter. Let's not even attempt to have things pass a cost-benefit test. So I think we need to thread that needle carefully. But I think the argument is overstated kind of from both sides. You don't want to ignore the deficit for sure, but then you also don't want to let the deficit dictate your policy response. We are going to, when we're on the other side of this, we're going to have increased the ratio of the national debt to annual GDP from 75% up to above 100%. So we are going to have significantly expanded the size of the national debt when this is all said and done. And I mean, really, it's going to be a lot bigger. And we need to take that seriously. The policy prescription for dealing with that is the same as it's always been, the same as it was before coronavirus, and the same as it will be after, which is to spending on our middle class old age retirement programs, and to generate additional tax revenue by broadening the tax base. So the way that we address the debt will be the same as it was before coronavirus, or at least should be the same. But this may provide an additional sense of urgency.
So one other primary trade-off that has been a huge debate recently, I know you've been a part of it to some extent, is the trade-off between keeping everyone at home, keeping the economy shut down, and therefore protecting vulnerable lives, versus reopening the economy, which obviously has an impact on millions of lives as well. Both from an economic and a moral, ethical perspective, how would you suggest we consider, making these kind of impossible trade-offs in this dilemma?
Well, yeah, I think it's really difficult. So, I mean, let me first say that I think that these goals weren't really in conflict so far. We have suffered significant economic damage by shutting down the economy. My view is that if we hadn't shut down the economy, the damage we would have accrued to the economy would have been significantly larger. So I think we actually reduced the amount of economic damage that we would have had by shutting down. If we had let the virus spread the way it likely would have, and we had 500,000 people die or something like that, the damage to the economy from the virus would have been much larger than the damage to the economy from the shutdown. So the kind of public health goal and the economic goal were aligned, but we're approaching the point where they're going to diverge. And to put some numbers on it, I mean, imagine a situation where the choice is 40,000 deaths and a 20% unemployment rate, or 75,000 deaths and a 15% unemployment rate. That's the kind of choice we're going to have to make, and that's just an extremely difficult choice. Even talking about that in those terms makes a lot of people extremely uncomfortable, and I'm completely sympathetic to that. At the same time that it's very reasonable and understandable to be uncomfortable by that conversation, it's also the case that the government engages in that kind of a trade-off all the time. We have to set the speed limit. If we lowered the speed limit on interstate highways from 70 miles an hour to 50 miles an hour, we would save thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. But we've decided that the benefits from a faster speed limit are worth that higher fatality rate from driving. We do the same thing with food and drug regulations. We do the same thing with workplace safety regulations. So this is a trade-off. We do the same thing with environmental regulations. So this is a trade-off that governments are very experienced at making, and I think we just have to decide, and we're gonna make a decision as a society about what that trade-off looks like. It's not going to be the kind of aesthetics of that conversation are not going to be smart, thoughtful, serious people sitting around a room and making some sort of a determination. I mean, that social decision is going to take place in part in those kinds of venues, but also on cable news and on talk radio and on social media. It could be a challenging and difficult discussion. But society has no choice really, but to make that determination. And I think we have reached the point where the public health situation and the economic situation have become in tension with each other.
Yeah, so in light of those trade-offs and those calculations, at this point, if you could say in kind of broad strokes, you just wrote a piece about this in Bloomberg, kind of providing some basic plans for how we might think about reopening the economy. In broad strokes, there's a lot of uncertainty right now still, obviously.
Yeah.
But how would you think about reopening?
Well, I think we have to think about a goal, right? So it's not like we're going to say, okay, on May 1st, we're going back to work, and then we just flick a switch and everything is back to normal. I mean, we are going to emerge from our homes and go back out into normal life, delicately and gradually, and the virus is still going to be there, and so we have to think about what kind of information do we need to determine how aggressively we should engage in social distancing. So, say our plan is that on May 1st, child care centers reopen and small shops reopen. And then on May 10th, large businesses reopen, department stores, those sorts of things, and office buildings reopen. And then on May 20th, shopping malls reopen, and then on July 1st, we reopen baseball stadiums. We have some sort of a plan. So then we're reopening things. People are trying to figure out, what their actual risk tolerance is and what's going to happen, knowing that as we reopen, the virus is going to increase its rate of transmission. So how do we know when to pause that process? How do we know when we need to close the stadiums again, but maybe leave the childcare centers open? How do we know when we need to not close the restaurants, but require that tables be spaced out further apart? Things of this nature. And so we need a metric, and ideally that metric would be testing, randomly selected groups of people that form statistically valid pictures of the overall population, but I think we're just not going to have that testing ability at that level. So what else do we look at? Maybe we look at hospital utilization, and if the share of ICU beds that are vacant hits 75%, hits 25%, then we know we need to turn up social distancing measures to make sure we don't run out of ICU capacity. Things of that nature. So we need to think about what information do we need, and what kind of specific metrics do we need in order to actually be able to reopen in a way that's safe and responsible with respect to public health. We also need to have different parts of the country under different social distancing regimes. There are going to be parts of the country that are ready to reopen much sooner than other parts. We shouldn't keep the parts that are ready to reopen shut down in order to enforce some sort of national strategy. It's also going to be likely the case that come the fall, if we need to turn the dial of social distancing up a little bit, that we're going to need to do that in some places and not in others. So a regional approach is going to be, I think, very important to this as well. Just kind of trying to think, strategically about what do we really need. What should be scaled back first. I think will be important. So that's kind of that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it.
So let's turn to some student questions, and one is related to that. The White House recently, this is from Justin Branham, the White House made an initial announcement about forming a committee to reopen America, which has received some criticism. What do you think of the current efforts within government to think seriously about reopening the economy. How would you assess those efforts so far?
Who asked this question?
Justin Branham.
Is he on the video here?
He's not.
Oh, okay.
They're submitting questions and I'll read them.
I see. I'm not going to talk to them.
No.
Okay. Well, I like talking to the students in our program, and maybe I should just say, while it's come up, that I'm just so grateful for the students for joining, and for being a part of our campus programs. Tyler and Chris and everybody at AEI do so much work to make this successful for the students, and all of us at AEI know that the students on this call have a lot of other things they could be doing, and so we're just very grateful that you're interested in AEI and that you're taking some time to be with us. I think the government's efforts about reopening are in a very early stage, and that's fine. I mean, it's this is a new situation, and so my hope is that over the coming days, really, or week or two, that we move rapidly toward a concrete plan for what reopening looks like. What metrics should we be looking at? How do we prioritize things in society? How do we gradually phase in a reopening? How do we know if we need to increase social distancing measures? And what kinds of policy changes are needed to support workers and businesses in order to make this as successful as possible?
So one other question from Matthew Ventrella at Boston College, who was in your summer honors course a couple years ago, I think.
Outstanding.
Yeah, he asked about something that we haven't talked about yet, which are the direct cash transfers to families that we're supposed to be getting in the next few days. What was the purpose of that? Is that going to be an effective response?
I think that the cash transfers, were fine. I think the situation was evolving so rapidly that I think the cash transfers were a good policy response to a problem that no longer existed at the time that the law was passed. So, where were we kind of initially with this? I don't remember specifically when this was. Say this is late February. We are concerned that this virus is spreading. We are concerned that is going to make people reluctant to go out to dinner or reluctant to go to movies, things of this nature. We are concerned that that's going to reduce the demand for goods and services in the economy. It's going to lead to people being laid off, et cetera. But what we are thinking at this point is that life will look pretty similar to how it looked, say in January. Stores are still going to be open, restaurants are still going to be open, people are still going to go shopping. Economic forecasts at the time were forecasting the unemployment rate to move from 3.5% up to 6%. Forecasts at the time suggested that GDP growth in the second quarter of the year, that's April, May, and June, would slow to roughly zero, but that we would not have negative GDP growth. And that's kind of the situation that I think people were expecting. That is the context in which the checks to households idea was proposed. I was one of the people who was pushing for that, both in public and behind the scenes. And I think it was a sensible measure, in that context. Then what happened? Then the governors started shutting down their states. All of a sudden, instead of thinking that GDP growth would slow from positive 2% to 0 in the second quarter, people now think GDP growth will go from positive 2% to negative 30%. Instead of thinking the unemployment rate would go from 3.5% up to 6%, we now think the unemployment rate will go from 3.5% up to 18%. And so the world just changed dramatically when the governors started taking matters into their own hands, not waiting on Washington, and began just shutting down their economies. In that context, the checks are fine, but they really don't do a whole lot, and are not, I mean, it's like bringing a squirt gun, into a battlefield, So what's needed, and what Congress passed are programs that really try to address in a serious way the problem that businesses won't have revenue for 2 or 3 months, the problem that we're going to have 20 or 25 million new unemployed workers, the problem that state governments are going to be pushed to the brink, the problem that large businesses are going to be severely liquidity constrained, and that some may even face a solvency crisis. That stuff was all in the Phase 3 CARES Act as well, and that's really the stuff that's going to end up making a difference. And of course, the Fed's doing lots of stuff too, but that's another story.
So one of the things that you talked about before we started talking about the pandemic was that even bigger than globalization, something that we need to be concerned about is automation and the effects that could have on the labor force. So Roman Lobos asked, will the pandemic accelerate automation and the displacement of workers? Do you think it'll have a significant impact on that?
This is an excellent question. I mean, it might. So, what we know is that businesses often use economic downturns in order to kind of make changes to the way that they do business. And one of the big changes that businesses make to the way that they do business is they say, is there a piece of equipment or a piece of software that I can invest in, that I can spend a bunch of money on, but that will allow me to save money over the long run. And that is the process of technology displacing workers. Again, that's the kind of thing that businesses, that's the kind of decision that businesses pull the trigger on more often in an economic downturn than they do in a growing economy, because they need to cut costs and it's easier to lay off their workers and things of that nature. So that would suggest that we will see that during this downturn. At the same time, this is going to be a pretty unusual downturn. And it could, like we talked about earlier, it could be very short. Relatively speaking, we could make, rapid economic progress. We could see a really fast rate of economic growth in the third quarter, in the fourth quarter of this year. We could see really rapid declines in the unemployment rate. And so, businesses may be thinking, hey, I was doing fine on February 15th with the situation I had, and we just need to get back to that. That was only 3 months ago, or whatever it will be, and I don't need to be making big changes right now. And so I think we'll just have to see, but it's certainly a very good thing to be keeping your eye on.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the implications of this for some of the approaches to economics that you described at the beginning. So on the one hand, let's look at on the political left, one of the primary critiques of our market economy is that it has an effect of increasing inequality. One related question from Nidhi Krishnan is, how do you think this will affect the economy and our government's approach to the economy, in the sense that it has had a disproportionate effect on minority communities and people who are socioeconomically less well off? Do you think there will be a stronger impulse to try to, through the government, deal with inequalities in our economy as a result of this?
I would be surprised. if that's what happened. I mean, perhaps if the outcomes for different groups of Americans are so disparate that it prompts a national outcry, there could be something done along those measures. But if the scenario that you kind of have in mind is that we start to reopen early, we see significant economic improvement pretty quickly, and there's kind of a return to normalcy. Then this will have been a really difficult 2 or 3 month period, but not one that I think is likely to fundamentally change the kind of course of economic policy, in any deep way. I mean, I think the people who are worried about inequality in February are still going to be worried about it, and they're still going to want to increase taxes and increase spending programs in order to address it. And the people who were less worried about it, I think, are mostly gonna kind of have the same view that they had in February. If on the other hand this is a much more kind of prolonged and difficult public health period than many seem to think right now, and if different groups of Americans experience this really, really differently, then attitudes about what is appropriate for government to do and not to do, I think could change, or advisable for government to do and not to do could change. So I can certainly see it happening, but I think it would require a kind of a more dire situation than many of the public health experts think is the most scenario.
Okay, and somewhat related to that, we have 2 questions about populism, particularly looking at populism on the right, and whether that movement is going to continue or whether it's reached its peak. So we have one from Jonathan Nicastro, who asks, do you believe that there will be a bipartisan anti-globalist, anti-free market response to the current pandemic? And then Cameron Kayani asks, do you think the Hawley, Rubio, Orrin Cass economic populism on the right has reached its ascendancy, or will it, continue after this, and maybe because of this?
I think that one of the big drivers of populism is a perception that the elites have done things to benefit themselves, and that the people have paid the price for that. That was a big part of what drove populism following the financial crisis of 2008. I don't see that dynamic at play here. I don't think anybody thinks that the elites caused the coronavirus, for example. So I'm a little bit optimistic about the populist response to this. I also think that we will have an economic recovery that likely is pretty quick and that will accrue to the benefit of lower wage workers and middle wage workers. And so that should also kind of push against a populist impulse. Having said that, if you think about populism on the right as being heavily focused on anti-immigration and anti-globalization rhetoric and policy, I think there is a real opportunity here for that. There's an opportunity here to say, look, we are just too connected with China, and this virus started in China, and why would we have factories in China? Why would we have people flying back and forth to China all the time? I think that this could embolden anti-immigrant forces for kind of similar reasons. And my expectation is that you'll see some of that. I think populism on the left manifests itself as being kind of anti-wealthy people, and arguing that we should be taxing much more heavily the top 1% or the top 0.1%, and that we should have really much more generous middle class transfer programs. I think that will be emboldened by this for sure. The idea that this act of God happened that nobody planned for, that nobody could insure against. If you're a mom and pop small business owner, you can buy flood insurance and you can buy fire insurance, but you can't buy insurance against a pandemic that will cost you 3 months of revenue. And there'll be a perception, I think, that the rich were fine. Maybe their portfolio went from 300 million to 200 million, but they still have $200 million. Meanwhile, a lot of people are really suffering. And that'll be true. I mean, I think somebody whose losses in this situation are still find them with millions and millions of dollars in net worth, is doing a lot better than somebody who literally has a hard time putting food on the table, which millions of people are having a hard time with this very day. So I think that could embolden populism on the left. And so then the question is just how much, and really, a major question is what happens in November. Our political system is a presidential system to a large degree, and the government and the political parties really take a lot of their cues from the president. The Democrats had the choice to nominate a kind of mainstream establishment figure or to nominate a firebrand revolutionary populist, and they chose the mainstream establishment figure. That's a significant event in the story of kind of post 2008 populism. If Joe Biden wins, he's not going to become a born again populist. I mean, his policy agenda and his approach to being president will, of course, be shaped by populism, but he will not be. He will not be a populist. And so, if we end up electing a mainstream establishment Democrat, that's going to do a lot to extinguish the political viability of populism, and that will kind of calm down populism. And indeed, the fact that Biden won the nomination and not Sanders really suggests that on the political left, populism had been fading. President Trump is, before coronavirus, had been leaving a lot of the kind of populist rhetoric behind as well. He was really, planning on running on a kind of Morning Again in America campaign, which is very different than a campaign of grievance like he ran in 2016. So, we'll see what this does to him. But I think, that there's a pretty good chance that this will not result in a surge of populism that's anything like what we saw following the financial crisis 12 years ago, that gave birth to the Tea Party on the right, and that gave birth to Occupy Wall Street on the left, and that fueled President Trump back in 2015, when he started seeking the nomination. I wouldn't expect to see something like that.
Okay. So we have time for a few more questions, and I'd like to ask a few. We have a bunch of questions about the argument of your book, not related to the pandemic.
That's good. Has
everybody bought it? People are interested. There you go. Yeah.
Have they all bought it?
I hope so. If not, they should. How much is it?
Amazon is very cheap.
Okay, good.
Amazon.com.
Economics.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have one question from Vincent Arnold, who asks, what is wrong with the calculations that show the stagnant wage hypothesis? So that's one. Also a question from Marge Spadaro, who asks, what was the statistic that you cited about upward mobility that pushes back against, most kind of common arguments that there isn't upward mobility right now? And then finally, James Patterson, another of your SHP former students, asks,
is James on the call here?
I think he is.
He is. Hi, James. Yeah. How you doing, man?
He's doing great.
How do you know that? Is
I have no idea.
You? I still don't quite know how all this. Oh, I see. I can look at attendees.
Yeah.
Right. I don't quite
so James asks, on the public opinion part of it, if what you argue is true, why the broad thought that wages are stagnant, that there is an upward mobility, is that due to political expediency or misleading Pew polls?
Well, well, no, I don't see how to do this. Okay, there we go. I was trying to find people on the thing. Why? What drives the calculation? I think there are some technical issues with the calculation, that people can debate. But the big thing, maybe I can do it here for all you people. Yeah. Okay, so this is what average wages look like. And you see this period right here is a period of rapid increase from the end of World War II to roughly 1973. Then you see a 2-decade period where wages for typical workers really were stagnant or declining. Right? That is stagnation, that is decline. Then you see a period starting right about here, which is roughly 1993, where you see this big upward trend that's lasted for 3 decades. Again, not uninterrupted progress. I mean, you can see the Great Recession, for example, but the trend over the last 3 decades is clearly upward and positive. And so, what a lot of people are doing is they're just conflating those two different eras. So if you wanted to make the statement that for the last 50 years we experienced a period of stagnant wages and then a period of increasing wages, that's an accurate statement. But I think when people talk about wages being stagnant for decades, the way most people hear that, when a political leader or a commentator says that, is that's referring to their wages. And so that's why I think we need to talk about we need to be very clear about what time period we're talking about, and we need to talk about how wages have behaved differently in those two different periods of time, right? Over the last 3 decades, wages have not stagnated. Over the 2 decades that came before that period, they did. So it doesn't make sense to conflate those two periods. We just need to be talking about those two periods separately. A related point I would make is that 30 years is a long time. So a lot of the people who were engaged in this conversation were also engaged in it in 1995. And they were right in 1995 to be talking about wage stagnation. But 1995 was 25 years ago. A lot of time has passed, and so if you're talking about this issue today, you really can't just gloss over the last 3 decades, the last 30 years that have seen significant wage increases. But a lot of people do that. And then 2 more points about the narrative. Wages were stagnating for a couple of years after the Great Recession. And that's a real thing. As I said, it's not a story of uninterrupted progress. Despite that period of stagnation for a few years, on the whole, over the last 3 decades, wages have been increasing. But I think that period, I think, colored a lot of the discourse. And then finally, it's just a lot easier to get yourself elected to public office if you're talking about how terrible things are and how great they'll be when you fix them. It's easy for an incumbent to say things are great, reelect me. But for somebody who's seeking an office for the first time, that's just not a great political message, and I think people know that. So that's I think there are many reasons why that narrative exists, but I think those are a few big ones.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to the rest of the questions, but thanks for so many good questions from all the participants. And thank you, Mike, for taking the time to
The questions are
share
all
your
answered.
wisdom with us.
The
They're all
questions are
answered in there.
right there.
Mm-hmm. Well, keep growing the quarantine beard. I'm expecting a castaway type situation in a few weeks.
Well, it may happen because right now I need special equipment to get rid of it. You know, like I can't use my razor and shaving cream. That was not going to work. So I need, you know, there's back orders. So
and it'll take you 3 weeks to get it from Amazon.
Might get a little ornery.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Thanks again to our partners at the Hertog Foundation, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I do want to mention that we have another call scheduled next Wednesday, April 22nd at 12:30 Eastern Time with Matt Kraenig of the Atlantic Council and Georgetown University. He'll be talking about his new book on the return of great power rivalries. So please join us then. And again, thanks for tuning in today. Take care.